August 28, 1914. The First World War had only been going on for a few weeks. On the continent of Europe, armies were clashing with one another, German troops advancing toward France. But at sea, there was a strange silence, because the world's two most powerful navies had not yet truly touched each other. On one side, Britain's Grand Fleet. On the other, Germany's High Seas Fleet. Both sides had hundreds of guns, battleships, cruisers, destroyers. Everyone was waiting for the great naval battle. But no one wanted to take the first blow, especially the Germans, because the German Navy was extremely powerful, but numerically behind Britain's. Bringing the entire High Seas Fleet out into open water against the Grand Fleet could mean losing in a single day the navy Germany had spent years building. So the German plan was simple. Wait, draw Britain in, catch a small piece of the enemy, destroy it, then return to port. The British, on the other hand, had decided to do the exact opposite. Instead of setting up an old-style close blockade right in front of German ports, they would control the distant exits of the North Sea. There was an important reason for this. Submarines, torpedo boats, and mines now made large battleships approaching the coast far more vulnerable than before. But the British public wasn't particularly interested in such strategic details. In their eyes, the Royal Navy had ruled the seas for over a century. If war had started, the Navy should attack the enemy. Why would a navy carrying Trafalgar's legacy wait for the Germans to come and attack it? Winston Churchill, too, wanted similarly more aggressive action. And it was right at this moment that two British naval officers spotted a small but dangerous gap in German defenses: Commodore Roger Keyes and Commodore Reginald Tyrwhitt. Keyes was concerned with submarines. Tyrwhitt commanded destroyer forces. For weeks, the two men had been watching German movements around Heligoland Bight, and something had caught their attention. German destroyers operated on almost the same schedule every day. They left their bases in the evening. They patrolled through the night. When morning came, they returned. And German cruisers would meet them, escorting them back to port. Same route, same times, same habit. Order matters for a navy, but if the enemy learns your order, that order can turn into a weakness. This was exactly what Keyes and Tyrwhitt were thinking. Instead of searching for German destroyers out in the open sea, why not go to the place they passed through every morning? Why not wait for them right in front of their own bases? The plan gradually took shape. British destroyers would enter Heligoland Bight, catch the German patrol on its way back, and fall on it before it could reach shore. British submarines would also be waiting in the area. If larger German ships came out to help, this time the submarines would attack. On paper, it looked extremely elegant. In reality, the British were about to send dozens of small warships within a few miles of the German Navy's main bases. If the Germans reacted in time, the entire British force could be caught in the trap. On top of that, there was another problem. The British who had made the plan hadn't properly explained it to their own navy. The Grand Fleet's commander, Admiral John Jellicoe, was informed of the operation far too late. When Jellicoe learned of the plan, he wasn't pleased with the situation. Destroyers would go right in front of the German coast. Then what? What if German battlecruisers came out? What about the dreadnoughts? What if the British destroyers' return route was cut off? Jellicoe wanted to send heavy support. The Admiralty wasn't initially receptive to this. In the end, Jellicoe arranged reinforcements from his own forces. And into the story now entered a man we will see again and again at Dogger Bank and Jutland: David Beatty. Beatty had powerful battlecruisers in his hands, like Lion, Queen Mary, and Princess Royal. William Goodenough's light cruisers would also support the operation, Now the British attacking force was much stronger. But here's the incredible part. Some of the British commanders taking part in the attack were not properly informed that these reinforcements were coming. In other words, before the battle began, British ships had roughly been told this: any large ships you see in this area are probably the enemy. Then, without informing them, large British ships were sent into the same area. We'll soon see what this was about to cause. The morning of August 28th had thick fog. Visibility was very low. Ships disappeared from view after just a few kilometers at sea. This situation could help the British attack. It could also lead to disaster. Around 7 in the morning, HMS Arethusa and the British destroyers with her approached the German patrol line. First contact came. A German torpedo boat, G194. The moment the German ship spotted the British, it turned toward Heligoland. A radio message was sent. The alarm was raised. The British destroyers picked up speed. Tyrwhitt sent 4 ships ahead, and the battle actually began not with a great gunnery duel, but with a chase that started inside the fog. G194 is fleeing. The British destroyers are coming behind it. Gunfire is heard. The other German destroyers are trying to understand what's happening. Then they too turn south toward the coast. The British press on. Destroyers follow one another into the fog. German coastal batteries are ready to fire. But there's a problem. The fog is so thick that the gunners can't tell which ship is British and which is German. So the British are roaming right in front of the German base, but the German coastal guns, fearing they'll hit their own ships, can't effectively intervene. Tyrwhitt chased the German destroyers for about half an hour, but now he himself had begun to get too close to Heligoland, and the Germans were sending their first reinforcements. 2 light cruisers emerged from the fog. Stettin, Frauenlob. The Germans, who a minute earlier had been fleeing in front of the British destroyers, were now coming under the protection of their own cruisers. The balance shifted in an instant. The British destroyers began to fall back. Arethusa, meanwhile, engaged Frauenlob. On paper, Arethusa looked stronger. In reality, the ship was new. The crew wasn't experienced enough. What's more, some of her guns started malfunctioning. Frauenlob opened fire. Shells were striking Arethusa. The British cruiser began taking damage. Then a shell from one of Arethusa's 6-inch guns struck Frauenlob's bridge area. The German cruiser suffered heavy casualties and was forced to withdraw. But the battle hadn't stopped. Quite the opposite. Inside the fog, who was chasing whom kept constantly changing. Tyrwhitt changed direction again. 6 German destroyers were sighted. They started to flee. Among them, a ship named V187 was looking for a way out. In front of it, British cruisers. Behind it, British destroyers. If it turned right, the British. If it turned left, the British again. V187 desperately tried to break through the British line. It failed. The destroyers closed in on it. Gunfire began. V187 was hit and sank. While British ships were trying to rescue German sailors from the water, more German cruisers appeared out of the fog. Fire opened again. The rescue stopped. On the sea now, there were not only fighting ships, but sailors from both sides who had fallen into the water. Here, a very strange, human moment of the battle took place. A British submarine surfaced. In the water were both British and Germans. The submarine took as many of its own men as it could, but there wasn't room for all the Germans. It showed them a compass and pointed toward the shore. People who a few minutes earlier had been firing torpedoes at each other were now just trying to survive in the same sea. But Heligoland's truly incredible part hadn't started yet. Around 8:15 a.m., Roger Keyes saw 2 cruisers in the fog, 4 funneled ships. Keyes thought they were German. He immediately sent a message: "In contact with enemy cruisers." The only problem was, those ships weren't German. They were British, Lowestoft and Nottingham. Goodenough received the message. He thought Keyes was being chased by German cruisers. To rescue him, he turned his own cruisers toward Keyes's position. A little later, Keyes saw 4 more cruisers in the fog. Guess what he thought now? More Germans. And so a genuinely incredible situation emerged. The British commander thinks British cruisers are chasing him. He mistakes them for German, and he tries to lure these supposed German ships in front of the larger British battlecruisers. Meanwhile, Goodenough is coming to help Keyes. In short, part of the British fleet started hunting another part of its own fleet. When they got closer, the ships' identities became clear. You might think, fine, problem solved. No, because there were British submarines underwater, and they had no real way to communicate properly with anyone. Around 9:30 a.m., the British submarine E6 sighted a cruiser, HMS Southampton. But E6 didn't know it was a British ship. Torpedo tubes were readied. 2 torpedoes were fired. Both missed. Southampton saw the torpedoes coming. Now she too thought the submarine was German. The cruiser turned straight for the submarine. She tried to ram and sink her own submarine. E6 dove at the last moment. A British submarine had tried to torpedo its own cruiser. A British cruiser had tried to crush its own submarine. And all of this was happening under enemy fire. This is one of the things that makes Heligoland interesting. Britain was going to win this battle, but the plan was so poorly coordinated that they might not have even needed the Germans' help to lose. Meanwhile, things weren't going well on the German side either. Franz von Hipper was responsible for the defense, but he didn't have reliable information about the scale of the British attack. At first, he thought it was just a destroyer raid. Because of this, German cruisers began entering the battle area piecemeal, from different directions, rather than as one large force. And this mattered a great deal, because German ships arriving in small groups had no idea which British force they'd run into. Strasbourg arrived, Köln arrived, Ariadne arrived, Mainz arrived. In the fog, everyone was moving toward the sound of gunfire, but no one could see the whole battlefield. As the hours passed, the situation on the British side became dangerous. Arethusa was badly damaged. Fearless came alongside her. Ships were trying to make repairs in the middle of the sea. Destroyers circled around them. German cruisers kept attacking again and again. Strasbourg emerged from the fog. Gunfire began. British destroyers moved in for a torpedo attack. Strasbourg withdrew. Then Köln came. She too was forced to pull back in the face of the destroyer's torpedo threat. But there was another clock the British were aware of, ticking away. The tide. The shoals around the Jade Estuary limited how far out large German warships could sail, but the water was rising. What did this mean? The longer the British stayed here, the bigger the German ships that would come out to meet them would get. Now Tyrwhitt had cruisers in front of him. Soon battlecruisers might appear, then dreadnoughts, and the British force was still right in front of the German base. About 40 miles away, David Beatty was listening to the radio messages. The decision wasn't easy for him either. Battlecruisers were extremely valuable. If they got close to the German coast, they could hit mines. Submarines could attack. Worse, part of the main German fleet could suddenly appear in front of them. But Tyrwhitt wanted help. The British destroyers were exhausted. Arethusa was damaged. German cruisers were pouring into the area. Beatty finally made his decision. He would go in. 5 British battlecruisers turned: Lion, Queen Mary, Princess Royal, Invincible, New Zealand. The massive ships began racing southeast at close to full speed. Up to this point, Heligoland had been a battle of small ships. Destroyers had chased one another. Cruisers had searched for each other in the fog. Torpedo attacks had been carried out. But the rules of the game were about to change. Just before Beatty arrived, another drama began. HMS Mainz found herself caught among British forces. On one side, Goodenough's cruisers. On the other, Tyrwhitt's destroyers. The more Mainz tried to escape one, the more she ran into the other. The British cruisers opened fire. Mainz fired back. The destroyers closed in. The German ship fired on them too and hit some of them hard. But the ring was closing. Mainz's rudder was damaged. The ship lost the ability to maneuver. A torpedo struck her. Shells kept coming. Even so, the German crew kept firing, but there was nothing left that could change the outcome. The captain gave the order to abandon ship. Mainz is dying. The British destroyers stop firing, and the German sailors they had just been raining shells on, they now start pulling from the water. Keyes' ship comes alongside Mainz.
Hundreds of German sailors are rescued. But the battle wasn't over. Around 12:37, British destroyers in the fog looked west and saw enormous silhouettes. At first, just shapes, then funnels, then long hulls. Battlecruisers. Beatty had arrived. In one source, a British destroyer officer is said to have described the sight as like elephants moving in among small dogs. Into the complex battle that small destroyers and light cruisers had been fighting for hours, giant British ships were now entering. For the German cruisers, the situation changed in an instant. A few minutes earlier, they had been hunting British destroyers. Now the heavy guns of a battlecruiser like Lion were turned on them. Strasbourg spotted the British ships and immediately began to pull away. The fog was on her side. She disappeared. Cologne didn't have the same luck. She was left alone in front of Beatty's heavy ships. British guns opened fire. It was nearly impossible for a light cruiser to withstand battlecruiser fire. Cologne quickly took heavy damage. Just as Beatty was about to finish her off, another German cruiser appeared, Ariadne. Beatty's ships turned to the new target. Ariadne tried to flee, but Lion and Queen Mary's heavy guns opened fire. A few salvos, hits, fire. The German cruiser slowed, then came almost to a stop. Beatty left her to sink. Ariadne would go under the water hours later. At this point, Beatty faced another question. Keep going or pull out? The tide had now risen. German heavy ships could put out to sea. The British had accomplished their main mission. Sinking more German ships was tempting, but losing Lion or Queen Mary for the sake of one more cruiser? That would be an entirely different calculation. Beatty gave the order to withdraw. The British ships began turning northwest, but on the way, they ran into Cologne again. The German cruiser was still afloat. British heavy guns opened fire once more. This time, Cologne sank. Rear Admiral Leberecht Maas died with his ship. Many German sailors remained in the water. Rescue attempts began but were cut short because of the submarine threat. The British fleet was now leaving the area, and the bitterest part of it was this. German heavy ships arrived shortly after. Moltke and von der Tann came out from the Jade. Franz von Hipper later arrived in the area with Seydlitz, but there was no longer any British force left for them to fight. The battle was over. The outcome was heavy for Germany. Mainz sank. Köln sank. Ariadne sank. V-187 sank. Other German cruisers were also damaged. Britain, on the other hand, lost no ships. Because of this, in London, the outcome was received as a great victory. The Royal Navy had finally delivered the news everyone had been waiting for. Only a few weeks after the war began, British ships had gone right up to the German Navy's door, fought, sunk a few ships, and returned. Beatty was declared a hero. But there's a problem here. Was this battle really a magnificent success of British planning? Or did the outcome simply hide how badly the plan had been carried out? Because look again at what happened on the British side. Jellicoe was informed of the operation late. Some British commanders didn't know their own reinforcements were coming. Keyes mistook British cruisers for German ones. Goodenough was sent chasing after his own ships. A British submarine fired a torpedo at Southampton. Southampton tried to sink its own submarine. Arethusa wasn't adequately prepared for battle. On top of that, battle cruisers were used right in front of the German coast despite the mine and submarine threat. Sources show that some British officers later openly admitted just how big a disaster the operation could have turned into. So why did the British win? Because the Germans also made very serious mistakes. Most importantly, they didn't recognize the scale of the attack in time. Instead of sending their cruisers together, they fed them into the fog one by one, and the British met them one at a time. One German cruiser comes out, fights, withdraws. Another comes, then another. So the numerical advantage the German Navy should have had right in front of its own bases never really materialized. On the contrary, the moment Beatty arrived, the German light cruisers suddenly found themselves facing far heavier guns. I think this is the real story of Heligoland. This battle didn't show how strong either side was, but how dangerously both sides fought with incomplete information. There was fog.
There were wrong messages. There were delayed orders. There were commanders who mistook their own ships for the enemy. There were submarines that fired torpedoes at the wrong target. And in the middle of all this, thousands of sailors were trying to fight without even knowing what was happening a few kilometers away. Now let me ask you a question. If Beatty's battlecruisers hadn't arrived at the last moment, what do you think would have happened? Could the British destroyers have escaped anyway? Or could the German cruisers have regrouped and turned the attack around? Write what you think in the comments, because the consequences of this battle were bigger than just a few sunken cruisers. When Kaiser Wilhelm II saw the picture, he didn't like the outcome. The British had come right up to the front of the main German bases. German ships had sunk, and the high seas fleet hadn't been able to stop them. After this, tighter control began to be imposed on the movements of the German fleet. The Kaiser wanted operations that could lead to major losses to be avoided. Tirpitz, on the other hand, thought exactly the opposite. If you keep a fleet in port all the time to protect it, what was the point of that fleet's existence? But for the Kaiser, that was exactly the problem. Germany's navy was smaller than Britain's. Replacing lost, large ships wasn't easy. Because of this, the high seas fleet would act far more cautiously for a long time. Sources particularly emphasize that after Heligoland, the Kaiser increased operational restrictions on the fleet. The ironic thing is this: the Germans didn't know about all the confusion the British had experienced during the battle. From their own point of view, what they saw was much simpler. The British came, they pushed right up to the German coast, they sank ships, then they withdrew, and German heavy forces couldn't get there in time. This had a major effect on the psychology of the German Navy in just the first month of the war. But Britain's victory intoxication wouldn't last very long.
because the Royal Navy, having caught the German fleet right in front of its own home just 2 months later, would face a very different situation on the other side of the world. This time, the British wouldn't be the hunter. They would be the hunted. In the Pacific and off the coast of South America, the German East Asia Squadron was roaming. At its head was Admiral Maximilian von Spee, and the British force that would face Spee wasn't fast, modern, and overwhelming like Beatty's fleet at Heligoland. November 1st, 1914, off the coast of Chile. Coronel. The Royal Navy was about to experience something it hadn't been used to in over 100 years. A heavy naval defeat. 2 British armored cruisers would sink. Thousands of kilometers away, the victorious mood that had started at Heligoland would give way to shock. If you want to see how the naval war turned around after Heligoland, you can move on to our Battle of Coronel video linked on screen. Because at Heligoland, the Germans were caught right in front of their own coast. At Coronel, it would be the British's turn.